Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay, a first-year graduate student of Technical University Munich's Program of Responsibility in Science, Technology, and Society. This is our fifth episode of STS Shorts, a new video series from Eclectic Spacewalk in which we dialogue with a researcher, lecturer, writer, and/or eclectic human in the science, technology, and society discipline or related fields. These shorts will only be around 30 minutes in length, and the goal is to highlight and hopefully introduce a new audience to our guest research and work. Please grab a coffee, drink, and open your curious mind as we dive right in. So today we are pleased to be joined by Bucky Stanton. Bucky is a PhD candidate in STS at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, in the United States. He is researching energy transitions and past and future making in Arcadia, Greece. He runs the Twitter accounts for the Society of History of Technology, answering big questions, informed answers about technology and society, as well as the Early Career Interest Group formed to support graduate students and early career scholars in the history of technology. He is also a hashtag COVID calls producer, which is a quote, real-time historical archive of our COVID times. Welcome to STS Shorts, Bucky.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So first question, let's briefly talk about your past. So can you give us kind of an overview of your time before your PhD? And then how did you, first become interested in the STS field?
That's an incredible ask of me.
Yeah.
But I'll try and do it entertainingly. There's so many, and I'm sure everybody, like you asked this, it's like, how do I even approach this? So basically my time before coming to Rensselaer to do my PhD here, I grew up around Philadelphia. That's where I went to middle school and high school, and ended up going to college to Drexel University in Philadelphia, which is an engineering school, which STS listeners will know there's some sort of you always find like an STSE department, like nestled in the, like a tumor in the engineering school somehow. And I went there like as a business major, and I obviously hated that more than anything in the world, like for a year. And Drexel has these co-op systems. So I did a digital marketing co-op, and like wanted to, not ever approach anything ever again that was like a spreadsheet with search engine optimization or like any sort of
Okay.
I was just done. I was just done with it. And I was like, I had always been really interested in history. And I had always been really interested in kind of this kind of conceptual idea about ideas and technologies and then their interpretation. But I never really had a chance to explore them. I had taken AP US history in high school, where you kind of learn how to write an argument, but you don't really learn much else. And I was really interested by history my whole life, world history, ancient history, literally anything. I would just kind of go through phases. I was one of those history kids. And then I get to school and I change my major, and I'm like, Dad, I want to be a history major. And he's like, cool, do it. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it. And I did do it. I did it. I went right into it, and I got really, really into the department, into my classes, in just a history sense. But the thing about Drexel is that, like I said, it was a very little STS enclave kind of, and the historians there were very much historians of technology, historians of science, with STS kind of theory underlying it all. Okay. And so just through that, I ran into Amy Slayton, who is a historian of engineering and race and measures of rigor in American engineering. I ran into Scott Knowles, who was he's still someone I work with on COVID calls, and he's on my committee, a historian of disaster broadly, just as a socio-technical thing. And through them, I kind of, I also had a wonderful class with Debjani Bhattacharya, I think is how you say it. And she's a historian of science and technology, dealing with river and coastal systems and their management and governance in I think Northeast India, but in India, in Southeast Asia. And had a really good gender and science class with her. But anyhow, this is all to say that I was loosely interacting with these things. Sure. But I didn't quite know what STS was definably. I was more having I was getting kind of shards of it through like an article here, article there, but I didn't really like realize it as a like cohesive discipline or anything like that. I was really doing a history thing. And then my senior year, I did a project with Scott Knowles about it was like doing archival research for the 125th year of history of Drexel University. And I ended up writing a chapter with him in that with our colleague, Jason Ludwig. And it was an absolutely fabulous time. And I was hooked. I was really hooked on this awesome. Idea of writing history. And it was awesome to have that opportunity and do all that research. And obviously I love the archives. But then I went to do my thesis, and my advisor was Amy Slayton. And I ended up doing kind of my thesis about Thomas Jefferson, because I couldn't, I was like trained almost in being able to do like read English and shit. So like I wasn't like, couldn't do anything else at that point. So I was interested in Thomas Jefferson's racial taxonomy. So these kind of like his unique system he kind of developed to categorize like various races on the continent, and went through all these interesting threads. But the thesis ended up really being kind of a reflection about the formation of that system and how he designed it with this very like weird, classically inflected like noble savaging of indigenous people. For example, he's like, you go to an indigenous tribe and they know geometry. You go to like Black people, enslaved people, they don't know geometry, and like have this whole like Pythagorean idea of racial value. And so I examined that, and I think I'm just doing history, and then I give it to my advisor, Amy Slayton, and she gives me back after the first draft. It's like, this is great, I learned a lot, here are some things, but we only had so much time. And she ends up sending me some STS articles from Social Studies of Science, and she was like, this point, and she underlined throughout my thing, like, you're getting at very like kind of conceptual history about like the ideas. And that was the moment that I started to realize, wait, that's what I am interested in. It's not just this kind of chronological history, but it's this kind of like this formation. I mean, I was reading Foucault for the first time at that time. And it was very like, it all kind of crystallized in that moment. I was like, oh, what I was interested in was kind of like this underlying idea of value and measurement and science and how technology was all related. I wasn't really interested in Thomas Jefferson. And so eventually, to wrap it up, I was committed to going to grad school, but I didn't really know for what. And I was still, in my year off, I like taught myself some ancient Greek. I was getting into like this very classicist mode. And I was thinking about going for ancient history and like to a PhD program. And I met with Scott Knowles, and I said this on an episode of COVID calls with Scott, but I was telling him my plans, and he literally was like, don't do that. Like, don't be an ancient historian. You don't want to do that. That's not what you're interested in. You like that stuff, but that's part of what you're interested in. You're interested in this stuff. And at the time I was like, damn, like, cause that's like my dad not believing in me. But then like a day later, I was like, oh my gosh, like, he's right. And then so I applied to a bunch of STS programs, and the rest is history.
But that's a good mentor though. Little tough love and a little,
Exactly. It wasn't tough love necessarily. It was more like necessary love.
Okay. Yeah. I like that distinction because as a good mentor, I mean, you kind of not exactly saving the person from themselves, but just guiding them along to what, with your maturity and stuff. So that's really cool that happened. Well, let's, I mean, you talked a little bit about like the intersections of things, multidisciplinariness, and like all these kind of underlying, how do we make knowledge and value systems being embedded. So maybe we kind of just transition quickly, since it's kind of, not exactly out of left field, but different than the other work that you do, is this hashtag COVID calls. I mean, being a producer, like it's a quote, a real-time historical archive of our COVID times. And I kind of looked through it, and you guys have done like 500 episodes or something. And like, it's very interesting how you kind of like distinguish between, categorize, and there's something to be said about all that. But I guess briefly just talk about like what it is, and then why is it kind of interesting to look at COVID, that we live in this time that is completely different than say 3 years ago, or so yeah, go into that a little bit.
So COVID calls is it's the form of it is like a podcast, basically. You can go to Apple Podcast, Spotify, anything like that, and find it. And it's really the outgrowth, and there's several episodes that kind of address this. One in the beginning, at the very first part of the journey 2.5 years ago, and then one more recent, I think the 500 episode is, what is COVID calls? And if you want the official story, go there. But basically, Scott Knowles, who I had mentioned before, he when COVID, like there was that like 2-month period in America where the world was like actually ending. Like,
sky was falling.
The sky was straight up falling. Like every institution was like, we're firing everyone, maybe everybody was like, funny. Maybe society's failing. Like the Trump getting COVID. Like we all remember that Twitter day. It was wild times, and like Knowles has this thing because he's always all over the place. Scott Knowles, my mentor, I mentioned before, and he's always calling people to get the deal. Like a true kind of STS like scholar at that intersection of history and journalistic anthropology, trying to talk to people, trying to understand what's going on. And so he had this idea, which is like, I'm calling people anyways, like my friends, my experts, the historians of medicine. I know there's people who would know something to understand what's going on. Like, I should just record these things. I should make this like a little show. And Knowles, if you listen to the podcast, like has an amazing radio voice, much better than I will ever have. Okay. And like he naturally has that kind of like, that kind of like radio approach. I think that fit really well. And so he called me up and we figured out how to do it. And we eventually started doing it. And the point of the podcast really started as that, like, let's just start there and see where it goes. And eventually it became this idea where we are doing a live archive. Basically, like we're interviewing experts, we're interviewing everyday people, we're interviewing nurses, we're interviewing trashmen, we're interviewing professors of every kind, we're interviewing anyone and everybody that we could think of, and that would respond to our emails. We've talked to elected representatives, we've talked to everyone possible, or that we could think of from our networks. And shout out to Shafani Patel, who's a student at Drexel, for doing a lot of that scheduling. I just do the editing mostly and send wacky ideas over email for episodes and stuff. But that's the podcast. I would encourage everyone to listen to it. And again, the idea of the podcast, crucially, is not to be like a big popular podcast. It's more to create this it was to like create this kind of archive of the thing as it was happening, like to see how, like to create a database, but like not a database in a traditional sense, an archive, literally, of experiences, of scholarly perspectives, of scientific perspectives, humanistic perspectives, quotidian, everyday perspectives, and to have those in such a rigid chronology, because it's happening nearly every day. If you like, a lot of times Scott is doing like 4 episodes a day.
Oh, and wow. So he's really putting in some output.
He's ripping through these. I mean, it's crazy. I'm just sitting here like clicking, and listening to them. But basically, like, the idea is that like a historian, an anthropologist, anybody who's like going to be studying this disaster, and this is a really important disaster, as we all know, to answer that part of your question, because this was like it was one of those events that, like, if you like played a video game in 2011 in a dystopian timeline, they were always like, there was a bird flu in 2020, and 500 million people died or whatever, and you're like, that could never happen. And then you're like at the event, and so we saw this total like freeze down of governments, our stagnant capitalist world order being unable to like approach this in any way. So that's why it's an important disaster. But anyways, the idea is that it's a big archive that somebody in the future can go into.
Yeah,
and work from.
Yeah, and that right there, like the fact, it's a great, not just case study, but like in action. It's not like in theory, you're like actually doing something that maybe other people could theoretically do things, later on, but you're doing a lot of the legwork, which is very cool. So let's talk a little bit about like the history of technology tie-in. I think that's before we get into your dissertation and kind of like the real meat of everything. Like, why is this discipline kind of important to talk like about the history of technology? Because we do live in a technological society. How do we think reflexively about the history of technology? And then like also, relating this, kind of to the past and the imaginary. And you sent a quote that was great that you called the quote, the production of the past, and like how it's important to think about how the history of technology and other disciplines have ignored or failed to describe and analyze the process through which large technical structures intersect with what we know about the past. So I think that's, well said. So how do you really kind of like go through that? Like, how do you do that? And why is the history of technology important?
Okay. So, where do I begin there? So like, I think I kind of addressed before why the history of technology is like historiographically important in terms of the STS and forming that kind of like that base of like what I think is a lot of like what you get taught when you enter STS. But in terms of like bringing it more to the present, in my own work, and that phrase you said, the production of the past, there's been one guy, I think, who said that before, but he said it in more of a literary context. And so the production of the past, and this is like how I'm going to kind of get to the history of technology being important, is that I think if we approached the idea of the past through a more STS setting, we would almost go more science studies focused. We would kind of go like conceptual, right? We would think about if anyone's familiar with the work of Hayden White, meta history. He's more of a literary theorist, but he was in like an STS department that with Don Haraway, the history of consciousness.
Oh yeah.
UC Santa Barbara.
Heavyweights, Donnie Haraway. Here we go. Name
indeed.
drop.
And so that is one kind of way you could make that approach. But to me, and we'll get to this more in the research, what's really interesting is the idea of, yes, you have like this kind of meta history idea of there being kind of a representational field, like the past being as Don Haraway says in a chapter called The Past is a Contested Zone, the past being a contested space that science and technology are acting on. And in that article, she talks about basically primatology. It's from her primate visions era. She talks about kind of how like how these kind of notions of like ancient apes and the science that was being done, it was informing present politics and the politics of the research. And there was this mutual shaping back and forth between present and image of the past about like gender and gender essentialism and like what apes, how apes approach these kind of like sexuality and gender or whatever. And there's this relationship there. And that's more of that science studies approach, to give an example. And so with history of technology and with my phrase of production of the past, I'm trying to kind of like bring that idea of engaging with the shaping of how, ideas in the present, scientific with power, usually scientific and technological ideas, are shaped and shaping ideas about the past. So they're shaped by and they're shaping. And so in my work, I'm trying to kind of bring that to the plane of resource extraction, and trying to kind of show how, like, first of all, like digging through the underground, which is like how a lot of resources are created, mining, stuff like that, inherently interacts with evidentiary materials from the past, right? It deals with things that could be in the ground. Paleontology could deal with archaeology, could deal with just geology. And so there's a little bit there in terms of like Jeffrey Bowker has some work about kind of geological time being developed with oil development and there being connection there. And I'm kind of more in that zone as well. And so to like wrap it all together is to say, like, historians of technology have ignored this because it's not a very material thing. And that's what's compelling about it. The past is extremely slippery. It's not countable in the same way, not calculatable in the same way as something that would be like a large technical system that you could do, you could add up, or a scientific idea where you could chart, right? It's a very general notion. It's a very general idea that's kind of like, it's in the background culturally. We're always thinking about a past. It's in the present as we're like trying to think about the past and the future and the now. It's this very like, this background but present thing, and there's something perplexing, almost like a Mobius strip, a four-dimensional aspect to it where it can't be pinned down. And I think that's why the approach is it's a topic that hasn't necessarily been approached that much outside of like a scientific instrument context. And I think it's important because we need to think about the past being literally produced, to go back to that resource extraction metaphor.
Yep.
We need to think about not only how, and part of my work deals with, like, I'm an archaeology dick. How does this like machine work, right? How does it dig into the earth? What does it know? How does it process everything?
Right.
And how can we think about how that is similar to resource extraction, and what does that tell us? And like, how do not only these systems that explicitly, like an archaeology dig, make the past, which is kind of more of like a science studies approach, but how do large scale technical systems, like systems of electrification or systems of resource extraction, like in my case, this kind of coal, lignite coal, interact with the territory, both conceptually and materially, that the past is kind of sitting upon. And the past, again, just to be clear, we're talking about both this cultural background of what the past is, both these vague ideas of what the past was like, or if it was better or good, these kind of subjective positions. And we're also talking about literally academic history in the formation of it. And so I guess to wrap it all up a second time, I'm trying to get at that nexus. I'm trying to kind of get at that intersection, both see those like ideas accumulating and changing in like in a science studies way, looking at history and archaeology and how the ideas change with the approaches and the processing. But I'm also looking at like the broader kind of more popular ideas of like, what is the past and why is it valuable? And how does that intersect with resources or large systems?
No, man, well put, beautifully put. I really like the metaphor of the Mobius strip, because when I was thinking about it, it was like reciprocal feedback loops, like all the way down almost. But then, so I guess like to kind of segue right into this is like, so your dissertation kind of really is at the nexus of those kind of things. Is you have like energy and archaeology, and specifically in a region of Arcadia, Greece, and kind of like what the relationship is like materially, socially, meaningful resources. So just to kind of give a quote as well, is that there is a direct relationship, but also a history of development with archaeological resources that are specifically like underdeveloped in favor of the lignite, and I hope I'm saying that, coal energy source. Yeah. And then interesting folds in there to think about with, I mean, the direct material conflict and the more imaginative tensions between materials with evidentiary value and resources with energy value. Now, I know that that's a lot to kind of a mouthful, but at the same time, there are these kind of through lines that, it like you're making it not, it's so easy as a linear relationship between the past and the present and the future, but then how these all kind of like circle back in at how we kind of, not just knowledge production, but how we see culturally, socially. And then now with, which you've mentioned in your dissertation, and by the way, the links of a lot of this stuff will be in the description, so people can go ultra deep into this. Is that now, like with the lignite coal, not necessarily happening anymore or changing, things are changing now. Wind energy, there's a new kind of technical thing that is on the horizon, and it's doing other things of not just like, I guess, exploitation but you say reweaving past and present through imagining a sustainable heritage future, fulfilling at least part of the dreams of Arcadian futures past. So like there's things in this new wind energy that you can tie into the past as well, and tie into the coal mining. So let's just talk like, we have, 10 minutes or 5-10 minutes. So what exactly are you really trying to get at with your dissertation? Like, how is it coming along? I mean, you've had some field summers there in Greece. We talked about the weather and stuff. So that's got to be a cool, interesting experience that you go, you do the actual technical stuff, but then there's humans doing it, and then there's different processes, values, things with the materiality of the technical stuff, but then also like the knowledge production of the people. So let's just get into that.
Okay, so just let's try and organize this. I'm gonna say what I did. I've been to this region of Arcadia, Greece for 2 summers, and I worked as a topographical surveyor, like a participant observer in an anthropology way, on the Mount Lycaon excavation and survey project. Mount Lycaon is a classical sanctuary. There's a lower sanctuary on a lower part of the mountain. So classical being like what you think of when you think of ancient Greece, basically. Right. Plato, that era. And then there's a a large ash mound on the very top of the mountain with evidence going back all the way to the late Neolithic, so 6,000, 7,000 years ago.
Yep. Okay.
As a ritual location, and it's the sanctuary to Zeus. And so that's where I've worked. I've worked at the lower sanctuary, using a surveying rod, using an optical, computer, really just making a digital representation. And that's how I got there and was a part of that process and seeing archaeology. But right below, so the mountain is I'm on the mountain. In the valley below the mountain is like the entire middle of the valley is like gray. It looks like the moon. And the reason that it's gray is because there is a type of extremely low quality coal there called lignite coal. Lignite is basically peat, if you know what peat.
Yeah, of course.
It's advanced peat, basically. Like peat is going to lignite and lignite goes to coal. It isn't the hard coal you think of when you think about coal, right?
Yeah,
that's hundreds of millions of years old. This coal is like often less than 1 million years old. It's basically mud.
Okay.
So right below the archaeology site I'm working on, and I remember in the Thomas Jefferson example, I'm like having this kind of classical inflected thesis experience, and then I try and be an ancient historian before Scott's like, don't do that. So, but I've still packaged that in, and I'm like, oh, I'll do archaeology. I'll go to this site and do a project about, how an archaeological fact is made. I was reading lab life, grad student shit, reading Latour. And
Actor Network, all of the things, Latour.
Of course, I was just vibing
That's
out.
Hilarious.
But I go, and then I have that whole summer, and then I begin to like smell. And in the mornings on this archaeology dig on this mountain, you can smell the burning of this coal. And there's two huge towers. They look like nuclear towers in the valley below. And I'm like, what is going on there? And so I begin to shape my project around like figuring out the relationship between these two underground resources. Lignite is mined underground in the valley below. It's burned. Like I was saying, when it's burned, it smells like rotten eggs. It's horrible for the environment. It gives people cancer. But the region, like areas of America, like Virginia, for West Virginia, is very attached to the coal and the productivity that comes with it.
Yeah, for sure.
More so, I would say, than the identity that comes with the past in an area where there's just ruins everywhere. To basically an archaeological theme park. But to like kind of take this somewhere, that's kind of the setting. And I should also mention that get the phrase Arcadian, an adjective for like a rural or beautiful place. This is where Virgil, the Roman poet, talked about Arcadia in the Eclogues. Like this is supposed to be a natural and harmonious, bucolic place outside of the kind of fragmented nature culture relationship of antiquity and our present. Yet I'm here on an archaeology dig, making archaeological knowledge and representations, and like below the valley is dominated and the region is dominated by this kind of resource extraction, which destroys the earth and makes it gray and gives everyone cancer. The opposite of harmonious, right? So I start kind of moving through this relationship, and eventually I get a fellowship. The last year I do a lot of research in the power company's archives. It's called PPC in English, the Public Power Company in Greece. Reading, their materials and learning about how lignite even got started in the country and mined there. The power plants were built. And one really interesting connection between the underground and the past and this technological system, which was really an essential moment for modern Greece because it allowed it to produce energy domestically without importing oils. This was a really big like modernizing element of like Greece in the 1950s and 1960s, 70s and 80s. And so like they had to initially survey the lignite fields because they were kind of unknown, their quality, and they had to do really intensive surveying to get at what lignite was good enough to be burnt. Again, this is like some of the worst quality coal in the world. And one like really interesting direct relationship there, to get at what you said about the direct relationship, is they used paleontology, paleobotany. So that's paleontology, like that's old stuff, not exactly human all the time, not like sedentary civilizational settlements, but animals, layers of plant matter, fossils that get imprinted on soils and compositions of soil. And they built all this knowledge through surveying, not to kind of like juxtapose, like not to be juxtaposed against the lignite mining, but actually in tandem, to understand the lignite field and to understand where the good lignite was and how to have, they had to build a geological understanding of the time, which is an understanding of the past, of this valley, of the soil, of the geology, to enable the eventual building and state justification via this data that they developed for this power plant, which is the Megalopoly power plant, which is still working lightly today. So, you know, there's a direct relationship between building out information about the past and the this large scale technical system. There's, you know, and it's an ambiguous relationship. For example, you know, in that instance, they're almost like helping each other. But then there's another site, there's an archaeological site called Trapezuuntes, which is one of the first planned cities in the ancient Greek world. It's a really interesting story I wish I could get into, but it's a story that it's a city state in ancient Arcadia, classical era, again, what you think of with ancient Greece when you think ancient Greece. And the city basically got up and left and went to the Black Sea because they were making a bigger city, which is called Megalopoly, so big city. That's a whole other thing, but really interesting. But that city was basically abandoned. And today it sits right on the edge of the northwestern lignite field. And so it's basically unexcavated. And through my kind of heritage contacts and my work on the archaeology dig and my contacts through that, I ended up interviewing and seeing some documents. And basically like at least a quarter, if not half of that archaeological site, they don't totally know, fell into the lignite fields, was destroyed or fell into a retaining lake, which is, you know, when you have a power plant, you need fresh water to cool the generator.
Yep.
So that's just material that's gone. And so that's a more antagonistic relationship, direct antagonistic relationship between the coal and the archaeology. And to get at the developmental part, you know, Greece is a place, if anyone's ever been, that like they don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of industrial resources. They don't have iron. They don't have fresh water. They do not have coal besides the lignite coal. They don't have a large industry. They don't make a lot of things. They really are dependent on tourism, and a lot of that tourism since the end of the war, and I wish we could get into Greek history because it's fascinating history, especially modern history that barely anyone knows. Tourism was invested upon. If you go to Athens, I mean, or any major city near the coast or any area, it is built up. I mean, it is designed to capture tourists, to extract money from them as a real industry. Towns grow along these areas. It is really important to that country. And so you would think in a place like Megalopoly, which, like, again, we can't get into the history, but it should be an archaeological theme park, as one of my colleagues on the site said. I mean, it's just riven with amazing sites. The Temple of Apollo at Bassae, for example, is nearby. It was the first UNESCO site in Greece. One of the most complete temples in the Greek world. Megalopoly was a large city of the Arcadian League, which fought Sparta out with, or fought Athens out with Sparta, was a part of the Peloponnesian War. There's all these sites. You've got Lycosura, which is like the first city in the canon of ancient Greece. You've got these amazing sites, but it's barely developed, which is weird for somewhere like Greece to not have that. But, you know, the relationship I think that's obvious is there's this like developmental priority on the energy extraction system, which has to do with, any energy historian knows, this kind of post-World War II commitment to energy independence that so many countries were devoted to and wanted to kind of secure, especially once that oil crisis in the 70s happened. But that's what I mean when in the thing I sent you about there being a kind of developmental relationship. And how, like, you know, one thing's being deprioritizing the other. And just to like kind of wrap it all together to the wind stuff that you mentioned, lignite it's the lignite coal, it's kind of being, it's, you know, the locals I talked to call it a murder. It's being murdered. There's still lignite that can be mined, but basically because of European Union climate mandates and diminishing returns in the maintenance required for this kind of low quality coal to be burnt, and various other political economy factors that I don't need to get into here, it's being ended. lignite coal, which is a huge blow to the region's employment, the identity, everything. But one thing there's two things that are happening after lignite or being planned. There's the continuation of Arcadia as a site of energy extraction through wind turbines. And if anyone's ever been to Greece or the island of Evia, which is right outside Athens, you can see it when you're flying in. It's probably the most windmills you've ever seen in your life. The country is just full. But this process of windmill development is privatized under a subsidiary of the power company. It's a very messy thing. And the mountain I mentioned earlier, Mount Lycaon, which is still a very important mountain, they want to put windmills there. They want to put windmills all over the valley to use this landscape still to extract energy. Right. And so I call that kind of wind pass, even though green energy is this kind of like future oriented idea. I mean, I'm sure you see the like EU commercials where it will like I don't know, apparently Europeans like laughing on a green train or something, and then like green energy, like that. They show that all the time in Greece, at least. But that's pretty much the like whole campaign around that. But it should be this future-oriented project that inspires technological hope, notions of progress, ideas of like, oh, we're going somewhere, it's cleaner energy. But it's continuing the system of extraction actually that started with lignite. And the people there hate it. And one of the reasons they hate it, and this is how we connect it to archaeology, is because, and the past, is that the wind turbines actually have a great effect on the landscape. They change, as my friends and interlocutors say, they change the face of the mountain. They change how we relate to the mountain. They change what this landscape means to us. And what's interesting is that, you would think the lignite would do that. But actually, the lignite, it's kind of out of view. It's sunken, right? It doesn't affect that landscape vision. Not that people didn't have problems with the lignite, because there's always been a level of contestation. But they basically, that was something that secured a present and a future, right? That secured the region. But but didn't destroy the way that they really relate with the past there, which isn't necessarily archaeological or about the history, but more about the landscape, about the position of the mountains, about the environment, which is a really interesting intersection that I was trying to hint at earlier between kind of the past notions of nature and culture that kind of gets at how there's this interesting kind of perspective going on that's both critical of green energy, but also like trying to reconcile that with a identity that they call the Arcadian identity that's very strong and goes back 3,000 years and is really about nature, about the kind of way that you live in that natural environment and that ecology. And that's how they imagine the past. So I don't know if that all made sense, but that's kind of the connection to wind energy. And I should just say as a closing statement here that the work that archaeologists at Mount Lycaon and the local Greek effort, and effort is like their Ministry of Culture or archaeology. And so they're developing a park called Parhasian Heritage Park, which Parhasia was a region of Arcadia, very ancient, long story, that's the lore. But they're using this new identity to create this idea of a natural and cultural park, which will protect all of the region, Arcadia, and the borders of ancient Arcadia, because it's changed. And they're using that identity to try, that Arcadian landscape identity I talked about, they're trying to use that to protect the places, the natural environments, the local heritages that are more modern, for example, and use it as a way to get more development in the area, responsible, sustainable development, and to develop more of the archaeological resources, because it's broadly underdeveloped. There's not a lot of signage. There isn't a lot of maps. It's not easy for a tourist to go there who doesn't speak at least some Greek or at least read it. So anyhow, that's kind of how it all adds up. And so you see this undergirding of a story about energy and lignite and the Greek nation state after World War II, developing into this story about underground collisions and the ambiguous relationship between knowledge of the past and resource extraction, their conflicts, their kind of choreographies, their connections, and then that kind of accumulates, and this is the course of the dissertation I'm describing, accumulates in this kind of more me talking about coming from the underground, coming above surface, and engaging with wind energy and how that technological system is interacting with the past, be it through a landscape identity, or I should also mention, literally affecting archaeological sites that it will be near. For example, at Mount Arkadia, they want to put a windmill there. That's going to affect people going there.
Oh,
That's going
totally.
to affect what they find. That's
Yep.
going to affect the environment. It's a big change. You have to move a lot of stuff on a mountain to get a wind turbine to sit right. So that's kind of the course of things, if that makes sense.
That's super interesting, and obviously, like, I've only been to Thessaloniki, Greece, and so like it's kind of interesting that you can take so much history from one place, but then also how the through lines of the past kind of still are here, you know, in the present and will be in the future. So, you know, a lot of more interesting stuff. I will put a lot of the links in the description and make sure that, you know, people can kind of find your work, and then also, like, you know, talk and converse with you more. If you want to talk with Bucky, just go to Twitter and at Bucky Stanton, you know, and I'll also put a link to that. But this has been super interesting. You know, thanks for coming on, and really appreciate the work, and good luck on, you know, finishing the dissertation. That'll be super interesting for a lot of, you know, scholars and people. And then obviously the intersection between like STS and the history of technology and stuff. A lot of great scholarship. So, you know, thank you for coming on STS Shorts, Bucky. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity. You know, this is doing a lot of work for my own thought. Maybe you'll get there when you are writing your dissertation, if you're not. But I find that you need to talk about it. So this is really actually helping me more than you.
Okay, well, we'll take it at that. Okay, well, we're gonna finish up. So thanks again, and yeah, we'll see you on the next episode. All right.